All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. Cleared Hot episode number 5. I am currently smack dab dead center in the middle of moving my family from San Diego to Montana. And I'm not a huge fan of conducting interviews or conversations over Skype or over the computer. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I've been on the receiving end of that and I think it goes fine. But I think there's something to sitting down across from another human being and looking them in the eye and gauging their body language, feeling out how the conversation is going, and asking questions based off of all those visual cues. So instead of talking to a guest, your guest for today is going to be myself. And I'm not a huge fan of listening to myself talk. I actually was very hesitant to do a podcast just with me, but I put it out onto social media, and the overwhelming response was to continue on solo and answer some questions that people reached out to me on Twitter. So that's what I'm going to do. I picked 3 of the questions that I'm going to dig into a little bit. Hopefully you guys can glean something from my experiences and definitely the mistakes that I have made. And yeah, I might actually have to do it next week as well too, because I'm still going to be in the middle of this move. But shortly after that, I got a bunch of interesting people lined up, and we'll be right back at it. So here we go. Cleared Hot, episode number 5.
Okay, got the red smoke.
Gun run, north to south, west of the smoke, west of the smoke.
Okay, copy. West of the smoke. I'm looking at danger close now.
Come on with it, baby. Give it to me. I need it. You're cleared hot.
Copy, cleared hot.
Okay, here we go. So the first question that I want to answer, and I'm paraphrasing the question here a little bit, but its essence is, what is an important life lesson that you have learned? Now, I certainly have learned many along the way, but there's a couple that stick out for me more than most. And of the ones that stick out, this one could be the beacon that guides a lot of my behavior. So before I get to the lesson, I'll tell you guys a little bit of a story. Like most stories involving me, it's about me being an idiot and not realizing it at the time, and doing something that I thought was right in the moment, and in hindsight, I view as an error. But I'm glad I made this error because it taught me an important lesson. So from a very young age, I had no doubt in my mind as to what it is I wanted to do with my life. And if you know anything about me, you know that that desire was to become a Navy SEAL. So I was very lucky. I was able to pursue that and made it through training on my first try. The initial selection program is called BUDS, stands for Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL. Graduation of that program does not make you a SEAL. If anything, it's just the wide end of the filter, the very beginning of the selection process. And even upon graduation, I would say for most people, you have at least a year of additional training. Some people, a year and a half, maybe even 18 months of training before you actually become a SEAL. They pin a metal device on your chest called a trident, and they change your classification inside of the military system to 5326, which is the naval designator for a Navy SEAL. I completed BUDS, and like I said, that huge wide end of the filter in August of 1997. And by late 1998, I had successfully completed the additional training that was required. And when I earned my trident, it was done at the individual SEAL team level, meaning that each SEAL team determined what criteria they wanted people to know. And then you did a full day test, both oral and practical skills, with the senior personnel at the command. And at the end of that, you were told as to whether or not you passed and you got your trident, or you did not meet the standard, you were remediated, and you got multiple other chances to get your trident. So at the end of that, in 1998, I was attached to SEAL Team 5, which is my first duty station, and I was actually on my first trip with an operational element at a SEAL team, which is called a platoon, which is about 16 guys, 16 to 18 guys, depending on how many officers that you have. A platoon can be split down the middle into squads, squad 1, squad 2. Each squad can be comprised of fire teams. Point being that, it's mutually supporting elements, and we're generally working in even numbers, and we can break right down the middle. So in 98, late 98, I had finally earned my trident, which was definitely a huge moment in my life. And I went on my first trip with my SEAL platoon to Tucson, Arizona. And we were going out there to do what's called CAS, or Close Air Support. And we were actually working with A-10s out of the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson. And we were working for a week, and the training had been going great. You know, you get up early in the morning and you drive out to the range and talk on the radio. Aircraft would come in over and over and over again. They weren't dropping real bombs, but they would drop training bombs so you could see ordnance leave the aircraft and impact the ground. Working on your radio skills, just kind of, honing your ability to talk on the radio and get aircraft to release ordnance. And, what do you say right before they release ordnance? You tell them that they're cleared hot. And again, that's where the name of the podcast comes from. So our last day out there, which I'm pretty sure was a Friday, the aircraft had a scheduling conflict, and they were not able to fly that day. So we had a down day before we drove back to San Diego. This was pre 9/11. There was no enemy to fight. So when we had off time, we partied extremely hard. So I'm going to say somewhere between 10 a.m. to noon, the decision was made that the platoon was going to go to a establishment for gentlemen, and we were going to begin the drinking evolution. Now, at this point in time, I was actually underage. So I was using the ID of somebody else in the SEAL platoon to get inside of this particular establishment to start drinking. We were successful in that endeavor, and copious amounts of alcohol began to flow. Fast forward, God knows how many hours from that, and we ended up in an Irish bar in downtown Tucson. And to set the stage a little bit more, my mindset early on in my SEAL career was that I was surrounded by my heroes. I had always wanted to be a SEAL, and here I am. I had finally earned the title of SEAL, and I'm surrounded by guys who had been in the SEAL teams for a decade, if not more. It was a humbling experience, to say the very least. And I would have walked on fire if these guys had asked me to, because I wanted to be a part of the team. I was where I wanted to be, but I also had a burning desire to be accepted and appreciated for who I was inside of the team as well. So needless to say, I was along for the ride. And I'll touch on that a little bit later on, but that was a choice, and I'll touch on that later as well. My decision to go with the flow instead of standing in the water and fighting the current was my own. So later on into the night, I do not remember exactly what started the verbal confrontation. I remember some guys were playing pool, and I'm relatively certain that a comment was made to a female patron, somehow related to the bar owner, that was not appreciated. And one of the members of our platoon was escorted out of the bar by the bouncers. Now, in the environment that I came from, if you fight one of us, you're fighting all of us. But I think slightly cooler heads prevailed at that time, even though we were definitely very intoxicated. So we kind of all banded together and went outside to see how the situation was developing. And the police had been called, and the bouncer was laying on top of one of the guys from the platoon. He wasn't really resisting, which was smart, because it would have involved more bouncers and probably some jail time. But when the police showed up, he was handcuffed and put into the back of the cop car. And the police started asking about what had happened. They started interviewing members from the platoon, me being one of them. They asked what we were, doing out in Tucson. Were we in the military? What did we do inside of the military? And the vast majority of us were very forthcoming with that information, to include myself. Told them my name, told them my duty station. I think I actually told them where we were staying. And in our dealing with the police, they agreed to let our platoon mate out of the back of the cop car if we agreed to take him straight back to the base and put him to bed, which we did. He, on the other hand, had a slightly different plan as to how the evening was going to go when he was removed from the back of the cop car. So of the probably 10 guys in the platoon who were out that night, 6 or 7 of them were going back to a government van, which we were driving around Tucson in. They were heading back that direction. I was kind of hanging back to watch what was happening with him with one or two other guys. And as soon as he got let out of the cop car, one of the guys in the platoon kind of grabbed him by the arms, like, hey, we're going to get out of here. We crossed the street, headed over towards the van. And I would say we were 99% clear. And he turned around, saw the bouncer that he had been in the altercation with, and went on a beeline for the guy, walking straight. And this guy was just sitting at the entryway, not the entryway that he'd been kicked out at, but another entryway to the bar. He's just standing there doing his job. And this guy from the platoon starts not only walking at the guy, but verbally going at him, the classic drunk asshole. I think we've all been there. At least I know I have been. And one of the other guys from the platoon, 6 feet from that guy, one of the other guys from the platoon ran up to him, grabbed him, and turned him around. So now they were both facing away from the bouncer. And they were probably 10 feet from me and 6 feet from the bouncer. So I was the only one who could see the bouncer at the time. And standing right next to the bouncer was a guy who had a metal crutch. Like, you break your leg and you go to the hospital and you get a metal crutch. And as soon as the guy from the platoon turned around and started walking away, the bouncer said something to that guy, picked up his crutch, grabbed it at the base, and looked like he was getting ready to swing it at my platoon mate's head. So I, in my infinite wisdom, took a step to the side so that the guy could see me, pulled a Spyderco knife out of my pocket, which, here's a hot tip. Don't take a knife into a bar. Not that I think you can even do that anymore, but at that time, it was like, hey, if you're a SEAL, you have a Spyderco knife on you. So I did. I made the decision to pull it out. I flipped it open, and I put it up against my quad. And I just told the guy, I'm like, hey, I don't think you want to do that. As soon as the guy saw it, he took a step back and put the crutch down. I folded the knife up, turned around, and started walking the other direction. And immediately, the bouncer started yelling for the police. So at this point, in my head, I think I have two choices. I can either sit there and I can try to talk my way out of this with the police, or I can run. So I handed my knife to one of the guys in the platoon, and I immediately started walking the other direction. And I probably got 15 feet before the lights lit up and the sirens came on. And I took off. So I took off running, was sprinting down the road. I think I made a left and then a right down a gravel alley. Halfway down the alley, I see a chain link fence with razor wire over the top of it. And at this point, like, the cop car is literally right behind me. I can hear the tires on the gravel. I didn't actually look back to see how far it was, but they were close. And I grabbed this chain link fence at full sprint. My feet kind of swung out from underneath me, and I cleared this thing in, half a second. Over the top of the razor wire fence, I climbed up a tree, jumped off of the tree onto a metal shack that was abutting a building, jumped onto the top of the building, and then ran the length of the building to the far end where I could see the edge of the building, but there was a tree that was had a really big growth at the top, and so a portion of the tree was hiding the lip of the building. And I figured that would be a great place to hide. So I would just hang myself off of the side of this building, inside of like the foliage of the tree, and they wouldn't be able to see me. So that's what I did. And that seemed like a good idea to about 30 seconds. And then I started getting pretty tired of holding on. And then at about 45 seconds, it started getting damn near impossible for me to hold on. And probably about a minute into it, I just let go and started free falling towards the ground, impact the concrete directly in front of all the guys from my SEAL platoon who are walking to the government vehicle. And I would say that the surprise was equal on both sides. They probably thought that I was going to jail, and I certainly didn't think that I was going to land in front of them. So the surprise soon became joy. They picked me up, immediately switched out T-shirts with another guy that I was working with. We went across the street to another bar and continued drinking as multiple police cars were doing figure eight patterns trying to find me. Fast forward to the end of the night. As we were leaving that bar, there was another physical altercation that actually terminated into a fist fight One of the guys in the platoon actually ended up getting pretty bloodied up, but we all got into the vehicle. The night was coming to an end. I have a awesome scar to this day on my right hand from that razor wire. One of the points went almost through my hand, so one of the corpsmen was working on my hand for me. And the whole time, we're thinking, like, what an awesome night. We're badass Navy SEALs. We can look what we can do. We can do whatever the hell we want to do. Laws don't apply to us. We can say what we want. We can do what we want. What a great night. Let's wake up tomorrow, get back to base, and be even more awesome. So we get back to the gate at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, and as we pull in, the guard looks in, sees it's a Navy ID card, and I'm in the back of the van at this point, and I hear him say, "Is Andy Stumpf in the vehicle?" And at that point, I knew that I was completely screwed because they wanted to see IDs from everybody. So I handed over my ID. Well, the police that I had originally run from, who in my infinite wisdom forgot that I had given them my true name, the duty station that I was attached to, and the base we were staying at, instead of really chasing me for that long, they just went to my hotel room, which is kind of what we were staying at. It's called the BEQ, Bachelor's Enlisted Quarters. It's basically a hotel on military bases. Yeah, they just went to the parking lot there. So while I was thinking I was super smart, they had basically played chess while I was playing checkers and were 3 moves ahead of where I was. So they get called to the front gate. I get pulled out of the back of the car, and my night ends with being in the back of a police car. So my saving grace of not going to jail, I did get charged with a couple misdemeanors, and I'm pretty sure it was like a 3rd-class felony that eventually got dropped along the way, so I never actually had anything on my record. My saving grace is that they had called my command, and they had talked to the command, and the command had done a great job of basically talking them out of sending me to jail because they said that they would take care of me when I got back to base, which is exactly what happened. So I returned to the SEAL team the following day, which was on a Saturday, to the leadership being at the SEAL team waiting for us to give us a little chat on how they thought our behavior represented SEAL Team 5. Needless to say, they were far less impressed with my behavior than I was. And the following Monday, after the weekend, I had to go to a chief board. And a chief board is the beginning of a disciplinary process on the enlisted side of the house. A chief in the Navy, the ranks go E1 through E9. A chief is an E7. And in the enlisted side of the house, the jump from E6 to E7 is the jump from middle management to upper management and true leadership responsibilities. That is the watershed moment in your enlisted career. So I had to stand in front of a group of very seasoned, very salty chief petty officers, in addition to many other people who were there that night. They wanted to talk to just about everybody and not get just my statement on what had happened. So I had to stand before them and I had to justify my actions. And I did, and I justified them in the manner that they played out in my mind, and I was not trying to instigate a violent act upon that individual. I was more trying to avoid a violent act being instigated on somebody who had their back turned. I explained to them where I ran and why I ran and my thought process with that, and then I left the room. Now, in the disciplinary process, if you start with a chief's board, the chiefs make a recommendation to the executive officer, which is the second in command of a SEAL team, and the commanding officer, which is the individual overall in charge for everything that happens at the team. Now, mind you, the commanding officer is the one who gave me my trident, who pinned it on my chest and sent the paperwork in to change my classification to 5326. So the following day, I was standing tall in front of his desk with the leadership of my platoon. And at the time, we were wearing woodland camouflage uniforms, which I was in a starched camouflage woodland uniform with a trident sewn on. It was a trident patch, not a metal pin, sewn on to the left breast pocket of my uniform. And after educating me on how my actions impacted how civilians view not only SEAL Team 5, but all SEALs in general, given that most people do not encounter them in everyday life, He slid a pair of scissors. He slid a pair of scissors across the desk to me and told me to cut my trident off. Now, he didn't take my trident from me, which would have been a career-ending move, meaning removing the designator from my name, but he would not allow me to wear it, even though I had only earned it 3 weeks prior. And I had to stand there at his desk with a pair of scissors and cut my trident off of my chest, put it on his table, turn around, and walk out back to the SEAL platoon that I was serving with for all of them to see. Because the stitching outline of where the trident used to be, I felt like it might as well have been a set of neon lights. So, sorry, a slightly longer story that I intended on giving, but it lays the groundwork for the lesson that I learned in that night, and then in the punishment in the days that followed. What it comes down to is that I thought I was a total badass. I thought I was untouchable. I thought I was above the law, right? Because I was a Navy SEAL, right? Look at me, king shit, Navy SEAL. Nobody, almost nobody is able to accomplish it and have this job title. I can do whatever it is that I want to without consequence. What I learned from that, and what I have carried forward every single day since then, is that you can never escape your actions. You have to own them. And you can't hide behind a pin on your chest. You can't hide behind a badge. And you can't hide behind a job title. If you do those things, you're a coward. It reinforced to me that I always had a choice. And I always have a choice. And that the environment around me doesn't dictate the choices that I make. It might corner me a little bit and narrow my selection pool, but I always have a choice. I learned that I should never look to the actions of others to justify my own, that I alone am responsible for the things that I do. This lesson has stuck with me through my entire career in the SEAL teams. Imagine that lesson, or not having learned it, or falling into the trap of trying to justify your behavior because of the world around you, or because of what the people around you are up to, or what they're doing. Think about that in an environment where you're tasked with potentially taking life. And an environment, and sometimes when you're taking life, you're by yourself. There's nobody looking over your shoulders. So what should I have done? What I should have done is force the guy to leave. What I should have done is, instead of being awe of the people that I was around, I should have stepped in and done the right thing and told the guys that I was with, like, hey, shut up. Hey, what you're doing is not the right thing. You need to set the example, not be the example of shit behavior. That's what I should have done. But I allowed my station in life to cloud my judgment and to be a barrier to me instead of stepping up and take that action. And, a couple years after this, when I was screening to go to development group, there's 2 portions of the screening. Actually, there's 3. So one of them is a physical test, the basic run, swim, push-up, pull-up stuff. The other one is you sit down with a psychiatrist or psychologist. I actually don't really know the difference between the two, or what the title was of the guy who was sitting across from me. But the third one is an oral interview with senior members of the command. And they set it up to be uncomfortable. They create the classic horseshoe-shaped tables, and you're sitting in the middle by yourself, surrounded by people who are asking you questions. And the questions they're difficult. It's not what's your favorite color. It's more about what would you do in this particular situation. And the very first question that they asked me was about that night in Tucson. And the way it was phrased came from a Master Chief. And like I explained the ranks earlier, a Master Chief is an E9. So he's at the pinnacle of the enlisted ranks. So I'm paraphrasing the question slightly, but it was along the lines of this. He and I are in a bar, and I'm the designated driver, and he's trying to get me to drink. And he's playing the card of he's the command master chief, he's the senior development group operator, and I'm the new guy. And he's trying to get me to drink. What would I do? Would I succumb to that pressure? And my answer to him was no. I don't care what your rank is, and I don't care what your job title is. The lesson I learned from that day, and the reason that I'm glad the incident in Tucson occurred, because it burned and seared into who I am, is that I own my actions. And regardless of your rank or title, I'm not going to do what you say. I'm going to stand up and I'm going to do the right thing. And I'm going to set the example for you when you're setting a bad one. And they didn't ask me a second question about that incident. We moved on to other things. I was picked up for selection and continued on my career at that command. So that's one of the biggest and most important life lessons that I learned. I look back at that night and I feel like an idiot for my actions, but I'm incredibly grateful that that night occurred because it did help shape the way I have thought since that day going forward. Question number 2. This one comes from Mr. Kingsbury, and it was on advice for raising quality human beings. So let's start with a disclaimer. I don't know if I'm even remotely qualified to provide any advice to anybody on parenting. I would like to think that I'm raising quality human beings and citizens that are not going to end up being serial killers. But my kids are a little bit crazy sometimes. So take what I say with a grain of salt. But having said that, when I interact with my kids, and the number one thing that I try to remember when dealing with my kids, and the answer to this question, I think, is in the question itself. Advice on raising quality humans. I think the answer to that lies in being human being yourself. Be human. Be honest about your mistakes and your shortcomings. And this is something I try to do all the time because my behavior is not perfect with my kids. I'll have times where I respond to them in ways that I shouldn't, and it eats at me. And I'll be shorter with them than I should have been, and they don't deserve it, and it eats at me. And when that happens, and when I feel like that, I go to them and I talk to them. I mean, I have 3 kids now, 2 boys, one's 13, one's almost 12, and a daughter who's 9. So, age-appropriate communication is basically plain English with them at this point. And I sit them down, and I make them look me in the eye, and I tell them I'm sorry that I'm not perfect. I am a human just like they are, and the only advantage I have over them is I have a few more laps around the sun, but I'm not perfect, and I've made more mistakes than they probably ever will, and it's okay to make mistakes, but just own up to your mistakes. So I apologize to them directly for what it is that happened. Set the example. I mean, it's a repetitive term. I know I say it all the time, but I truly think that it makes an incredible impact. I want my children to be compassionate, all 3 of them. And the only way that I can get them to be compassionate is to show compassion. I want them to love, and I want them to love very deeply. And the only way that I can do that is to show them what that looks like. And the mistakes falls into that just as well. If I want my kids to have integrity, I mean, who else is going to teach your children integrity? I mean, you could wait for some external force to do so, but you're going to spend so much more time with them than anybody else. If you want them to have integrity, show them integrity, which, again, back to apologizing for the mistakes that you make. One thing that grounds me quite a bit when dealing with my kids, and I wish I had found this much earlier than I did, but my wife and I went to some marriage counseling about 2 years ago now. And it was very intense, emotionally draining, much more so than physically draining. But one of the exercises that we did during that was you put yourself in the position of yourself as a child. Pick the age, and probably somewhere between 8 to 11, or maybe even a teenager. But you put yourself into the position, and you go back in time to when you were a child, and another person who is in the marriage counseling, not your significant other, stands in front of you, and you're supposed to talk to that individual as if they are your father, and then you do it again as if they are your mother, and you talk to them about what it is you needed from them when you were a kid that they didn't provide. And as soon as that exercise started, it floored me. The thought of my children being damaged for life by me, it was devastating. And it changed the way I have thought about parenting, because it's so easy to dismiss and make the excuse, I don't have time, or be distracted over something that is totally bullshit and doesn't matter and usually originates from an electronic device, as opposed to answering a question that might seem innocuous that one of your kids asks. And those examples that I just gave, those are things that I'm guilty of. I'm not saying other people are. Those are things that those two things specifically, I have tried to improve in and of myself. But again, it has changed and shifted the way I think about parenting. I have to set the example for my kids and show them that they matter and that what they think matters and that their opinions are valued. And again, I wish I had gone through that counseling much earlier than I had, because it shifted my perspective. And I guess on the parenting thing, I had a few things written out here. One, just take the time for them. Be compassionate. I already covered that. Protect them, but don't shelter them. There is a difference in my mind, in my opinion, which take it or leave it for whatever you want to do, between providing a safe environment for your kids and sheltering them from the realities of real life. If your kids are teenagers and you are still doing everything for them, are they prepared for an environment where nobody has any interest in what they want, think, or need? I would say that you're not. So my children are always protected, but if it's capable for them to do it, they do it. And if there's an essence of risk involved with that, I'm right there next to them, but I'm not doing it for them. Teach them about integrity. And I think I covered this earlier. The only way to do that is to be the example of it. The last thing I'll leave with on the parenting side of the house, every day I drop my sons off at school and I tell them two things. The first one is be the example. And the second one is stand up for what you believe in. You have to teach your kids to stand up for what is right. And you can argue about what's wrong and what's right, or that's fine. That's bullshit. Everybody knows what wrong and right looks like. Teach your kids to stand up for what is right, and teach your kids to stand up for those that can't stand up for themselves. It'll make the world a better place. Third question was around my thoughts on female operators. So this question is commonly asked, but it's generally phrased in the terms, what do you think about women in combat? So to answer that, we have to go back in time a little bit, because I don't think most people understand the impact that women have been having on combat or near combat since as early as World War I. Women have been serving near or on the front lines since that time, and generally in the near the World War I times and in the conflicts near that time period, it was generally in the Nurse Corps. And I have some personal experience in this with my grandmother, who, and I didn't even realize this until recently, I was having a conversation with my father. She served, I'm going to take a stab at this and say the Korean War. She served as a nurse in the Korean War. And the volume and sheer, I don't even know the word to use, shocking nature of the injuries that were seen of the soldiers coming back, dealing with that day in and day out, the pain and the suffering and the death and the struggle. She had severe post-traumatic stress issues just from that. And for anyone who says that women serving in that capacity don't have as much impact as the people on the front lines, have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. All right. Everybody's service is important. And those that are supporting the combat troops, the direct line combat troops, is as equally as important as those who have a gun in their hand. So fast forwarding to modern day, we'll talk about OEF and OIF. OEF is Operation Enduring Freedom, which is Afghanistan. OIF is Operation Iraqi Freedom, which is Iraq. I think the names on both have been changed, but those are the names that I knew them by, so we're going to talk about those. Women have been serving in those environments since day one. And just, people who, again, get tied up with the air quotes, a combat job. If you deploy to a war zone, you're a combatant, period. You should expect combat. you should expect something violent to happen to you if you deploy to a theater of war. There are no safe spaces in war. All right, Afghanistan and Iraq are the perfect examples of that. And there have been many women killed in both countries in direct combat. So women have been serving in and around combat since combat began. Now, I think the question, though, because of the way it was phrased as female operators, I'm going to answer that from the perspective of people who ask about women SEALs or women going through BUDS, which has yet to happen, but it has now been opened up to women applicants. And my answer to this is probably more simple than people would expect. I believe in blind standards. I think that the criteria for an occupation should be set by the demands of the occupation. I think that the leaders of that occupation should determine the demands and create the standards. And if you meet those standards, you meet those standards. I personally don't care if it's a man or it's a woman. If a woman meets the same blind standards that the men have to meet to make it through BUDS and all the other standards along the way to serve as an operational SEAL, then guess what? Welcome to the SEAL teams. High five. Let's do this. The threat, and I think the risk is to the leadership and the integrity of the organization is modifying those standards to achieve a politically correct outcome. If you start mixing with the formula that has proven time and time again, and that those returning from the battlefield say meets the criteria for what the job demands in order to have a political victory, that's the beginning of the end. Because combat doesn't care if you're a man or a woman, and neither should your standard. And I'll leave it at that. Make a blind standard. If you meet the standard, you meet the standard. Okay, last question, and then I'm going to stop running my mouth. This question was, what is it that you are the most proud of and the least proud of? So the most proud of is very easy. I am the most proud of my kids. Hands down, there's not even a close second. They're all extraordinarily different and unique, and I love their differences, and I love the fact that they're unique. And at the end of the day, they're the only thing that matters when I'm gone. You know, nothing that I possess and nothing that I own comes with me when I go wherever it is that I go. But my kids remain, and they can change the world. At least that's what I tell them. So most proud of, that's a pretty easy one. The least proud of, this is a tough one for me, but this one also kind of sticks out above all the other dumb shit that I've done in my life. I'm the least proud of not saying the things that I needed to and wanted to before my mom died. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about the last interaction that I had. And it occurred at an odd time in my life, for sure. And it would be very easy for me to create excuses about why it is the way I behaved. But at the end of the day, I couldn't bring myself to say the things that I needed to, and it absolutely haunts me. So I was on my last combat deployment in 2010, and my mom was diagnosed. Let's take a step back. She was a cancer survivor for 10 years before she was diagnosed for the second time. She had cervical cancer to begin with, and probably, I want to say 2 weeks before I deployed for my last deployment to Afghanistan in 2010, my parents were at my house as kind of like a farewell, come down, hang out with the family. And my mom she was ill. She wasn't right. So we took her to the hospital where my sister worked, and they did a chest x-ray. And I could tell in the way my sister was walking that something was off. So I left the room where my mom was in, and I met her in the hallway, and she said that there was a mass in her lungs. So obviously the testing progressed from there, and it was determined that she had non-smoker's lung cancer, which has a survivability probability of nearly 0. Now, as this diagnosis was coming through and they were starting to work on the treatment options, I still had to go do my job. So the day that I left very early in the morning, even though our flight didn't leave until later in the afternoon, because I didn't want to drag my family through a lengthy, painful goodbye, both on my side and on my family's side. I got up in the morning and I hugged everybody goodbye. My oldest son actually woke up and came down the stairs. I gave him a huge hug. My wife a hug, my dad a hug, my mom a hug. And I remember as I was giving my mom a hug that I knew it might be the last time I would see her alive. And I went to work. Fast forward to August. I think that was in February. So fast forward to August. Obviously, we have pretty good connectivity overseas in that time, at least internet back and forth. And I was maintaining communication with my mom and keep getting updates, going back and forth. And the treatment wasn't working. And the treatment was getting to a point where she would have either died from the treatment or died from the cancer. So she had two choices, both of them terminating in death, one on her own terms and one on the terms of the medicine that she was taking to try to combat the cancer. And she chose to stop the cancer treatment and enter into hospice care. And at that time, my sister initiated a Red Cross message. I was overseas, received the Red Cross message, finished a brief for a combat operation, packed up my things real fast, hopped on a helicopter, completed my last combat operation of my career, came back from that helicopter, took a quick shower, got on another helicopter, went down to Kandahar, got on an airplane, and was home about 36 hours later. I got back home to San Diego. My mom was in the hospital up in Monterey, and got up there the next day to see her. And the first thought that went through my mind when I saw her was, she's dead. And I kick myself for that thought coming into my head, but the environment that I had come from, where life and death decisions were made on a daily basis, everything was extremely black and white, and there was no crying over spilled milk, to use a terrible analogy. Decisions were made, and then we moved forward from there. And that was the mindset that I was in when I made it back. And obviously I was incredibly grateful to see my mom, have nothing but love and compassion for my mom. But I wasn't able to get myself out of that black and white, very narrow, focused mindset that you develop when you spend a lot of time overseas. And that ended with me not able to show the love to somebody who had loved me unconditionally for their entire life. And that's my biggest regret. And what I've learned from that, and how I have tried to make myself a better person from that, is that constantly reminding myself you only get one lap around the track, and reverse isn't an option. I wish every day that I could go back and change the interaction, or just say something different than what I had said the last time I got to speak to her. So if you have something to say, eat your pride and do the right thing. You never know the impact that it might have on somebody else. And if you ever find yourself in a position like I'm in, it's tough to describe the regret that you have for not doing something that you should have done. So do the right thing, eat your pride. It might change somebody else's life. It might make them feel better. And in the end, that might make you feel a hell of a lot better too. And that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks. That's episode 5. All right, there we go. Episode 5 is in the books. Like I said, I think I'm going to be probably doing a solo podcast next week as well too. So start peppering me with questions now. I don't really care what platform you do it on. I'll try to get back to you if I can, or at least I'll take notes on the questions that come my way. If you're new to the podcast and you dig it, just help me spread the word. And if you don't dig it, then don't spread the word and go on iTunes and write a shitty review. And if you guys do like it, then do me a favor and write a good review.